Trump, Zelenskyy, and Putin, the high-stakes battle for Europe's future. In a dramatic turn of events, former U.S. President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy found themselves in a highly publicized confrontation last week. The exchange marked yet another unpredictable development in a month filled with geopolitical upheaval. First, Trump labeled Zelenskyy a dictator, then shocked global leaders by announcing he was negotiating a peace deal with Russian President Vladimir Putin without involving Ukraine or Europe. Shortly after, discussions of a major mineral deal surfaced, adding yet another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. But this conflict isn't just about territorial disputes or Ukraine's fate. The real stakes are much higher: the future of Europe's security architecture. Putin's grand strategy: rebuilding Russia's sphere of influence. To understand what's happening now, it's crucial to revisit Russian President Vladimir Putin's long-term ambitions. His worldview is rooted in the belief that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a geopolitical disaster that left Russia vulnerable and marginalized. Back in 2007, during a speech at the Munich Security Conference, Putin openly criticized the West, accusing it of breaking promises and expanding NATO's influence too close to Russia's borders. His message was clear: Russia would no longer tolerate what he saw as Western encroachment into its sphere of influence. His actions since then have been consistent with this vision. 2008, when Ukraine and Georgia expressed interest in joining NATO, Putin responded by invading Georgia and seizing control of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. 2014, he annexed Crimea and backed separatist movements in eastern Ukraine, ensuring that Kyiv remained in a state of instability. 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, aiming to overthrow its pro-Western government and install a regime loyal to Moscow. However, this plan was derailed by fierce Ukrainian resistance, bolstered by Western military support. Instead of a quick victory, Russia found itself in a grinding war of attrition, suffering over 300,000 casualties and failing to achieve its main objective: turning Ukraine into a client state. A stalemate, but no end in sight. Despite heavy losses, Putin remains committed to his goal. With the front lines largely static, he has turned to diplomatic maneuvering, and this is where Trump enters the picture. Putin has signaled a willingness to negotiate, but his demands remain steep: recognition of Russian control over occupied Ukrainian territories, severe limitations on Ukraine's military, a commitment that Ukraine will never join NATO or the European Union. In essence, he is seeking a new European order where Russia regains control over parts of Eastern Europe, reversing decades of Western influence. Trump's role: a wild card for Europe. Trump has made it abundantly clear that his priority is not protecting Ukraine, but ending the war quickly. Getting the war finished quickly, very quickly. While European leaders worry that Trump may cede too much to Putin, Trump himself believes he holds leverage over Russia. U.S. sanctions have placed immense pressure on the Russian economy, and Putin may be willing to compromise to secure relief. But the key question is, will Trump use that leverage against Putin or against Ukraine? Europe's dilemma: how to respond. For Europe, the situation is precarious. For decades, they relied on the U.S. as the backbone of NATO and the ultimate guarantor of their security. Now they face the terrifying possibility that Trump might cut a deal with Putin that undermines Ukraine, and by extension, European security. Most European nations agree that Ukraine must be protected, but they are divided on how to do so. 1. Full NATO membership for Ukraine. This would provide ironclad protection, as an attack on Ukraine would trigger a response from all NATO members. However, many NATO countries are reluctant to make this commitment, fearing it could escalate into direct conflict with Russia. 2. Deploying European troops to Ukraine. Some European leaders, including French President Emmanuel Macron, have suggested sending troops to Ukraine to deter further Russian aggression. But this would require significant resources, and many European nations lack the military capacity for such a deployment. 3. Increasing military aid. This is the safest political option, but Europe's defense industries may struggle to produce enough weapons to sustain Ukraine's fight in the long term. Zelenskyy versus Trump, A tense encounter. At the heart of this crisis is Ukraine itself, and Zelenskyy is not backing down. During their meeting, Trump hinted at the possibility of a security guarantee for Ukraine, suggesting that France and the UK were willing to contribute. But when Zelenskyy insisted that Ukraine would not accept a deal that left it vulnerable, Trump grew visibly irritated. The road ahead, a defining moment for Europe. As the dust settles from the tense Trump-Zelenskyy exchange, the geopolitical landscape remains fraught with uncertainty. The question now is how Europe, Ukraine, and the broader international community will respond to the prospect of a U.S. Russia negotiation that sidelines key European interests. Europe's search for security without the U.S., the realization that Washington's commitment to European security is no longer guaranteed, has set off a wave of strategic recalibration across the continent. Several key trends are emerging. Military buildup. European nations, particularly Germany, France, and Poland, are ramping up defense spending, expanding their armed forces, and boosting domestic arms production. NATO is also fast-tracking plans for a European-led rapid response force. Strategic autonomy. French President Emmanuel Macron has been vocal about Europe needing to stand on its own, advocating for a more independent European defense strategy that does not rely on U.S. military support. Alternative alliances. Some European nations are exploring regional security pacts to enhance deterrence, with Sweden and Finland's NATO accession marking a shift toward a more unified Nordic-Baltic defense posture. Russia's next moves, testing NATO's resolve. While Ukraine remains the immediate battleground, Putin's ambitions do not stop at Kyiv. Russia has already rebuilt much of its military capacity, and recent intelligence assessments suggest that it could challenge NATO's eastern flank within a few years. Potential flashpoints include the Baltic states. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania remain highly vulnerable to Russian hybrid warfare, including cyber attacks and political destabilization efforts. Moldova and Georgia, both countries face the risk of further Russian encroachment, with Moscow already maintaining control over separatist regions like Transnistria and South Ossetia. Poland and Eastern Europe. As a frontline NATO state, Poland has taken a leading role in European defense efforts, but an emboldened Russia could seek to undermine Warsaw's influence in the region. The future of Ukraine, a deal or a prolonged conflict. For Ukraine, the next few months will determine whether it can continue resisting Russian aggression or if it will be forced into an unfavorable peace settlement. The stakes are existential. If Trump pressures Ukraine into a deal that concedes Russian control over occupied territories, it could create a dangerous precedent, signaling to Moscow and other revisionist powers that military aggression yields results. Conversely, if Ukraine secures stronger Western support, it could hold out long enough to negotiate from a position of strength. Final thoughts. The fate of Europe hangs in the balance. The world is now watching a high-stakes diplomatic and military showdown that will define European security for decades. Will Trump leverage his influence over Putin to secure a sustainable peace, or will he abandon Ukraine in pursuit of a quick deal? For European leaders, the answer may determine whether the post-Cold War order survives, or if a new era of geopolitical instability takes hold across the continent. One thing is certain, the coming months will shape the future of global security in ways we have yet to fully comprehend. For Zelenskyy, this meeting was a disaster. Trump's reluctance to commit to Ukraine's security suggests that he may pressure Kyiv to accept Putin's terms, regardless of the consequences for Ukraine or Europe. What happens next? Europe is now scrambling to secure its future without relying on the U.S. Some nations are accelerating efforts to build up their own military capabilities, while others are trying to convince Trump to pressure Putin rather than Ukraine. The reality is that Putin's ambitions extend beyond Ukraine. Russia has already rebuilt much of its land forces, its long-range missile systems remain intact, and its naval capabilities remain formidable. Intelligence reports indicate that Russia may be preparing to challenge NATO directly within a few years. If Ukraine is forced into an unfavorable peace deal, it could embolden Putin to take even more aggressive actions in the future, perhaps against the Baltic states, Poland, or other former Soviet republics. The stakes couldn't be higher. This is not just about Ukraine. It is about the balance of power in Europe. Final thoughts. The world is watching as Trump, Putin, and European leaders navigate an incredibly high-risk geopolitical game. Will Trump push Putin to make real concessions, or will he leave Ukraine and Europe vulnerable to future aggression? One thing is certain, the next few months will shape the future of European security for years to come. Harsh reality, weak, vulnerable, and in denial. For decades, Europe has relied on the United States as the ultimate guarantor of its security. From NATO's formation to the present day, American military power has shielded European nations from existential threats. But with Trump signaling a reluctance to defend Ukraine and potentially NATO itself, Europe faces an uncomfortable truth. It is too weak to defend itself alone. Panic and fear behind the facade. Europe's leaders publicly insist they are prepared to take on more responsibility, but behind closed doors, there is a growing sense of panic. The EU lacks a unified military force, its individual armies are small and underfunded, and decades of peace have left it strategically complacent. Germany, the economic powerhouse of Europe, has an embarrassingly weak military. France, with its nuclear arsenal, talks tough but lacks the ability to project power across the continent. Eastern European nations, the most vulnerable to Russian aggression, are desperately rearming, but know they cannot stand alone. Intelligence assessments paint a grim picture. Russia, despite its war in Ukraine, has rebuilt much of its land forces and continues to modernize its missile systems and navy. If Putin decides to push further west, Europe's defenses may not hold. Without the U.S., NATO's credibility is in question. Would Western European nations really rush to defend Poland or the Baltic states if Russia tested Article 5? Many Eastern Europeans fear the answer is no. The colonial arrogance that prevents acceptance. Despite this growing fear, Europe struggles to admit its dependence on the U.S. Centuries of colonial dominance, in which European powers ruled much of the world, have left a deep-seated belief in European superiority. France, Britain, and Germany still see themselves as global players, even as their actual military power has diminished. The idea that they now rely on Washington for protection is humiliating. This arrogance prevents a clear-eyed assessment of reality. European leaders speak of strategic autonomy, but their military budgets tell a different story. Many still fail to meet NATO's 2% GDP defense spending target, and there is little coordination in building a serious pan-European defense structure. Meanwhile, Washington's warnings are ignored, and European elites continue to indulge in the fantasy that diplomacy alone can contain Putin. The inevitable reckoning. Reality, however, is catching up. If Trump forces Ukraine into a weak peace deal, Putin will be emboldened. If NATO is tested and the U.S. hesitates, Europe will face its greatest crisis since World War II. The panic already setting in behind closed doors will spill into the open. Some European nations will scramble for individual deals with Russia. Others will beg Washington to stay committed. Some may even discuss nuclear armament to compensate for American withdrawal. The illusion of European strength is crumbling. The continent is not ready to stand alone, but its leaders refuse to admit it. The longer Europe clings to its outdated sense of power, the worse its fall will be if the U.S. truly steps back. And when that moment comes, the same arrogance that once made Europe a global empire may now become its greatest weakness. Europe's nightmare, the threat of a Russo-American alliance. As if facing Russia alone wasn't terrifying enough, Europe is now haunted by an even darker possibility. What if the U.S. and Russia strike a deal at Europe's expense? The idea once seemed unthinkable, but Trump's unpredictability, his skepticism of NATO, and his desire to strike grand bargains raised the chilling prospect of Washington and Moscow aligning against a weak, fragmented Europe. Why would the U.S. and Russia align? A U.S.-Russia alliance wouldn't necessarily be formal, but even a quiet understanding between the two powers could devastate Europe. Trump has repeatedly expressed admiration for Putin, criticized NATO as a financial burden, and hinted at cutting deals with adversaries rather than engaging in prolonged conflicts. If he sees Europe as weak, arrogant, and ungrateful, as many of his statements suggest, He might conclude that cooperating with Russia is more beneficial than defending a continent that refuses to pull its weight. Such an arrangement could take several forms: a Ukraine deal that favors Russia, allowing Putin to keep occupied territories in exchange for a superficial ceasefire; a new security framework where the U.S. reduces its role in NATO, forcing Europe to fend for itself while Washington prioritizes China; a division of influence where Russia dominates Eastern Europe while the U.S. focuses on global economic and military competition elsewhere. From Moscow's perspective, such an understanding would be a dream scenario. It would allow Russia to consolidate power over former Soviet territories while keeping Europe divided, isolated, and fearful. Europe's panic and fragmentation. The mere possibility of a Russo-American alignment is already sending shockwaves through European capitals. Some nations, particularly in Eastern Europe, are rushing to strengthen their own defenses, but they know they stand little chance alone. Others, like France and Germany, are trying to establish an independent European security framework, but years of underinvestment and lack of coordination make this nearly impossible in the short term. At the same time, cracks within Europe are widening. Poland and the Baltic states are desperately seeking closer ties with the U.S., fearing abandonment. France and Germany are clinging to diplomatic efforts, hoping to persuade Trump to stay committed. Southern Europe remains more focused on economic issues than military ones, deepening the continent's disunity. The fear is real. Without the U.S., Europe is exposed. If Washington decides that maintaining NATO is no longer in its interest and instead pursues a deal with Russia, Europe could face its worst geopolitical crisis since World War II. A harsh wake-up call. For too long, Europe has assumed that American protection was permanent. It dismissed warnings about its military weakness and arrogantly resisted calls to take defense seriously. Now, with the U.S. possibly stepping back and Russia on the offensive, Europe is finally waking up, but perhaps too late. The nightmare scenario of a U.S. Russia understanding isn't just paranoia, it is a real possibility. And if it happens, Europe will find itself not only weak and divided, but also trapped between two superpowers that no longer see it as a priority. The post-World War II order is crumbling, and Europe must either adapt fast or face the consequences of its own complacency. The prospect of a combined U.S.-Russia military alliance presents a daunting scenario for Western European nations. Such an alliance would significantly overshadow Europe's military capabilities across various domains, from conventional forces to advanced technologies. Land forces. The combined active-duty personnel of the U.S. and Russia total approximately 2.54 million soldiers, with reserves adding another 2.81 million. In contrast, major Western European countries like Germany, France, and the United Kingdom collectively maintain around 600,000 active-duty personnel. Russia alone possesses over 12,000 main battle tanks, such as the T-72, T-80, and T-90 models, while the U.S. fields approximately 6,600 M1 Abrams tanks. Western Europe's tank numbers are significantly lower, reflecting years of reduced defense spending. Air power. The U.S. Air Force operates over 13,000 aircraft, including advanced fighters like the F-35 and F-22. Russia adds approximately 4,100 aircraft to this tally, featuring models like the Su-35 and MiG-29. Collectively, this amounts to over 17,000 military aircraft. In comparison, Western European nations operate around 2,000 military aircraft, with fewer fifth-generation fighters. Naval strength. The U.S. Navy boasts 11 active aircraft carriers, complemented by a fleet of 68 nuclear-powered submarines. Russia contributes 1 aircraft carrier and 58 submarines. Western Europe's naval forces include the UK's 2 aircraft carriers and France's single carrier, with a combined submarine fleet of around 30 vessels. This disparity underscores a significant gap in naval projection capabilities. Nuclear arsenal. Russia leads with approximately 5,889 nuclear warheads, while the U.S. maintains about 5,244. France and the UK, Western Europe's nuclear powers, possess approximately 290 and 225 warheads, respectively. This results in a combined U.S.-Russia total of over 11,000 warheads, vastly outnumbering Western Europe's nuclear stockpile. Space and cyber warfare. The U.S. established the United States Space Force in 2020, emphasizing the strategic importance of space. Russia integrates space operations within its aerospace forces. Both nations possess advanced cyber warfare capabilities, with the U.S. Cyber Command and Russia's GRU and FSB leading their respective efforts. Western European countries have developed cyber units, but they lack the scale and integration seen in U.S. and Russian operations. That's defense production and industrial capacity. The U.S. dominates the global arms trade, capturing 43% of the market over the past 5 years. Russia maintains a robust defense industry, focusing on missile technology and armored vehicles. Western Europe's defense sector is substantial but fragmented, leading to inefficiencies. While France has emerged as the second largest global arms exporter, Europe's reliance on U.S. military equipment, such as the F-35 fighter jet and Patriot air defense systems, highlights gaps in indigenous production capabilities. Technological advancements and futuristic warfare. The U.S. leads in stealth technology, missile defense systems like THAAD, and drone warfare. Russia has invested in hypersonic missiles, including the Avangard system, and advanced air defense systems like the S-500. Western Europe has made strides in certain areas, but often lags in deploying cutting-edge military technologies. Biological warfare. Both the U.S. and Russia are signatories to the Biological Weapons Convention, which prohibits the development and use of biological weapons. While there is limited public information on current capabilities, historical programs suggest both nations have expertise in this domain. Western European countries adhere strictly to international conventions, focusing their efforts on biodefense and public health preparedness. Conclusion. In the hypothetical scenario of a U.S.-Russia alliance, Western Europe's military capabilities would be significantly overshadowed across multiple domains. The combined strengths of the U.S. and Russia in conventional forces, nuclear arsenals, technological advancements, and defense production would present a formidable challenge to Europe's fragmented and comparatively weaker military posture. The inevitable defeat, Europe versus a Russo-American alliance. If the United States and Russia were to form an alliance, Europe would face an overwhelming military, economic, and technological disadvantage. The continent's military weakness, lack of unity, and dependence on U.S. defense technology would lead to a swift and crushing defeat. Here's how the conflict would unfold across different domains. 1. The land war, a European collapse. Numerical inferiority. A combined U.S.-Russia force would deploy over 2.5 million active troops with millions more in reserve. Europe, even if fully mobilized, lacks the manpower to match this scale. Armor and firepower. The U.S. and Russia together possess over 18,000 battle tanks, compared to fewer than 3,500 modern tanks across Western Europe. Russian forces, already experienced from Ukraine, would spearhead rapid armored assaults while the U.S. provides logistical superiority and advanced battlefield coordination. Geography and logistics. Russia's land access to Europe means it can launch a massive blitzkrieg, while U.S. forces operate from key bases in the UK and Poland, overwhelming European defenses in a two-front war. Outcome. Within weeks, Russian forces would overrun Eastern and Central Europe, while U.S. launched precision strikes and logistics cut off any European counteroffensive. 2. The air war, total U.S.-Russia domination. Sheer numbers. The U.S. and Russia would command over 17,000 military aircraft, including stealth bombers, hypersonic missiles, and electronic warfare aircraft. Western Europe has fewer than 2,500 aircraft, many of which are outdated. Superior technology. U.S. F-35s and F-22s, combined with Russia's Su-35s and MiG-31 interceptors, would achieve air superiority within days, grounding European forces. Long-range missiles. The U.S. and Russia both have long-range missile capabilities, e.g. Tomahawk, Caliber, and Hypersonic Zircon, enabling them to strike deep into European territory with minimal resistance. Outcome. Europe's air force would be neutralized within the first week, leaving its cities and infrastructure vulnerable to missile and drone strikes. Naval warfare. Europe's fleets crushed. Aircraft carrier superiority. The U.S. operates 11 aircraft carriers. Russia contributes 1, while Western Europe has just three: France's Charles de Gaulle and the UK's Queen Elizabeth-class carriers. Submarine warfare. The U.S. and Russia have over 125 nuclear and diesel submarines, while Western Europe has around 30. European shipping lanes would be cut off instantly. Naval strikes. U.S. and Russian warships armed with hypersonic missiles, Zircon, SM-6, etc., would sink European vessels before they could even engage. Outcome. The Atlantic and Mediterranean would be dominated by the Russo-American alliance, isolating Europe from reinforcements or supplies. 4. The nuclear threat. No contest. Massive stockpile. The U.S. and Russia have a combined 11,000 nuclear warheads, while Europe, France, and the UK has just 515. First strike capability. A coordinated nuclear strike by the U.S. and Russia would overwhelm Europe's missile defense systems, rendering retaliation impossible. Deterrence failure. The UK and France's nuclear arsenals are too small to counterstrike effectively. They would face obliteration if they attempted nuclear retaliation. Outcome. Europe would be forced into immediate surrender under the threat of annihilation. 5. Industrial and technological inferiority. Weapons production. The U.S. produces nearly 43% of the world's arms exports, and Russia adds 16%. Europe relies heavily on U.S. technology and lacks the ability to ramp up arms production quickly. AI and cyber warfare. The U.S. leads in AI-powered defense systems, cyber warfare, and electronic jamming, making European defenses obsolete. Hypersonic weapons. Russia has already deployed hypersonic missiles like Vanguard, while the U.S. is developing multiple hypersonic platforms. Europe has no hypersonic capability to counter this. Outcome. Europe's war effort would collapse within months due to supply shortages, cyber attacks, and technological inferiority. Futuristic warfare. Space, cyber, and bio-warfare. Space dominance. The U.S. Space Force and Russia's space warfare programs would disable Europe's satellites, crippling its communication and navigation systems. Biological warfare. The U.S. and Russia have advanced biodefense capabilities, while Europe has little capacity to defend against biowarfare threats. Cyber warfare. Russia's GRU cyber units and U.S. Cyber Command could shut down Europe's power grids, the inevitable. Let's discuss some historical events that led to the USA and the USSR drifting apart after fighting together in World War II. Let's analyze the historical facts. The Cold War, a global struggle for supremacy. The Cold War, 1947 to 1991, was a geopolitical, ideological, and strategic confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. It shaped the modern world through proxy wars, nuclear arms races, espionage, economic competition, and political maneuvering. The conflict was deeply influenced by classical geopolitical theories and continues to impact contemporary international relations. This detailed note explores the origins, key geopolitical theories, strategic developments, and long-term implications of the Cold War. 1. Origins of the Cold War. The power vacuum. After World War II. The defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in 1945 left a power vacuum. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers with fundamentally different ideologies. The U.S. championed capitalism, democracy, and free markets. The USSR promoted communism, central planning, and authoritarian control. The ideological conflict shaped the post-war world order, with both powers vying for global influence. 1.2 The Yalta and Potsdam Conferences. During the final years of World War II, Allied leaders met to decide the fate of post-war Europe. Yalta Conference, February 1945. The Allies, US, UK, USSR, agreed to divide Germany into occupation zones. Potsdam Conference, July 1945. Tensions surfaced as the US and USSR disagreed over Eastern Europe's future. The Soviet Union sought to establish pro-communist governments, while the US pushed for democratic elections. These disagreements laid the groundwork for the Cold War. 1.3 The Truman Doctrine and Containment Policy. In 1947, U.S. President Harry Truman introduced the Truman Doctrine, pledging to support nations threatened by communism. This marked the beginning of the containment policy, which aimed to prevent Soviet expansion. 1.4 The Marshall Plan versus Soviet expansion. The Marshall Plan, 1948, provided economic aid to Western Europe to rebuild after World War II and resist communism. The Soviet Union, in response, established the Molotov Plan and later the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, to strengthen communist economies. These rival economic strategies deepened the Cold War divide. Schacht's geopolitical theories that shaped the Cold War. The Cold War was heavily influenced by classical geopolitical theories, which shaped U.S. and Soviet strategies. Ashdod 2.1 Alfred Thayer Mahan, The Power of the Sea. Mahan's sea power theory emphasized naval dominance for global control. His key ideas included controlling maritime trade routes ensures power projection. A strong navy is vital for a nation's security. Naval bases and choke points, e.g. Panama Canal, Gibraltar, are strategic assets. The U.S. applied Mahan's ideas by expanding its navy, securing global naval bases, and controlling key sea routes. 2.2 Halford Mackinder, The Heartland Theory. Mackinder argued that land power, not sea power, determines global dominance. His theory stated, who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world. The Soviet Union, which controlled the heartland, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, became a major global power. This theory justified U.S. efforts to contain Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. 2. SA 2.3 Nicholas Spikeman, The Rimland Theory. Spikeman modified Mackinder's theory, arguing that controlling the coastal regions around Eurasia, the Rimland, was key to global dominance. He stated, who controls the Rimland rules Eurasia. Who rules Eurasia controls the destinies of the world. The Rimland included Western Europe, the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and China. This theory influenced U.S. containment strategies, forming alliances like NATO 1949 and SATO 1954 to encircle the USSR, supporting proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan to prevent Soviet expansion, encouraging regional allies Japan, West Germany, South Korea to act as counterweights to communism. By implementing Spikeman's theory, the U.S. maintained a strategic presence in the Rimland, while the USSR attempted to penetrate these areas through proxy wars and revolutionary movements. 3. The Cold War as a global chessboard. The Cold War played out as a geopolitical chess game, with each side maneuvering to gain influence across the world. 1. The division of Europe. Europe became the primary battleground of the Cold War. The Iron Curtain. Winston Churchill's 1946 speech described the division of Europe into a communist East, Warsaw Pact, and capitalist West, NATO. Berlin Crisis, 1948 to 1949. The USSR blockaded West Berlin. The U.S. responded with the Berlin Airlift, ensuring the city's survival. The Berlin Wall, 1961 to 1989, built by the Soviets to prevent East Germans from fleeing to the West. It became the symbol of Cold War division. 3.2 Proxy wars and conflicts. Instead of direct confrontation, the U.S. and USSR fought through proxy wars. Korean War, 1950 to 1953. The U.S. and UN backed South Korea, while China and the USSR supported North Korea. The war ended in a stalemate at the 38th parallel. Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. The U.S. fought to prevent communist North Vietnam from taking over the South, but ultimately failed. Afghanistan War, 1979 to 1989. The USSR invaded Afghanistan. The U.S. supported the Mujahideen rebels, leading to a Soviet defeat. These conflicts drained resources and intensified Cold War tensions. 3. Espionage and intelligence warfare. The CIA, U.S., and KGB USSR engaged in a global intelligence war. Coups and regime changes. The U.S. orchestrated coups in Iran, 1953, Guatemala 1954, and Chile 1973 to prevent communist governments. The USSR backed revolutions in Cuba, Angola, and Nicaragua. Spy operations. Double agents like Kim Philby and Aldrich Ames infiltrated opposing intelligence agencies. Technological espionage. The U.S. and USSR stole military and industrial secrets from each other to gain an edge. SA 3.4 The Arms Race and Mutually Assured Destruction, MAD. Both superpowers built vast nuclear arsenals, leading to deterrence through mutually assured destruction, MAD. The hydrogen bomb, 1952. The U.S. developed the first thermonuclear bomb, followed by the USSR. ICBMs and SLBMs, both sides developed intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, for second strike capability. Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. The closest moment to nuclear war, the USSR placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, prompting a U.S. naval blockade. The crisis ended with a negotiated withdrawal. The fear of nuclear annihilation prevented direct war but intensified geopolitical competition. Nana 4, the role of Poland and the intermarium concept. Poland, a battleground of empires. Poland, caught between Germany and Russia, played a crucial role in Cold War geopolitics. After World War II, it became a Soviet satellite state, but Polish nationalism remained strong. Hash 4.2, the intermarium concept. Polish leader Józef Piłsudski proposed intermarium, Między Morza, a federation of Eastern European countries from the Baltic to the Black Sea to counter both German and Russian domination. Though intermarium never materialized, its ideas influenced U.S. Cold War strategy. The U.S. supported Eastern European dissidents to weaken the USSR. The fall of communism, 1989. Poland's solidarity movement, led by Lech Wałęsa, played a major role in the collapse of Soviet control in Eastern Europe. Modern geopolitics, NATO's eastern expansion, Poland, Baltic states, Ukraine's aspirations, echoes intermarium's strategic vision. The Cold War's end and modern implications. 5.1 The fall of the Soviet Union, 1991. The USSR collapsed due to economic stagnation, internal dissent and reform policies, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, economic restructuring, introduced by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, but led to political instability. Eastern European revolutions, 1989 to 1990. Communist regimes fell in Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. The 1991 Soviet coup and dissolution. Hardline communists failed to overthrow Gorbachev, and the USSR formally dissolved on December 26, 1991. Hash 5.2 The Cold War's legacy in modern geopolitics. Though the Cold War ended, its strategies and rivalries persist. Russia's post-Soviet strategy. Putin views the Soviet collapse as a geopolitical disaster and seeks to regain influence in Ukraine, Georgia, and Central Asia. U.S. and NATO's continued containment. The U.S. maintains military bases, economic sanctions, and alliances to counter Russian and Chinese influence. China's rise as a new challenge. China's Belt and Road Initiative mirrors Soviet strategies of economic expansion, while U.S. containment efforts now focus on the Indo-Pacific region. Part 6. Conclusion. The enduring impact of the Cold War. The Cold War was not just an ideological battle, but a contest shaped by geography, strategy, and historical theories. Mahan's naval strategy influenced U.S. dominance of global sea routes. Mackindor's Heartland theory framed Soviet expansion as a global threat. Spikeman's Rimland theory guided U.S. containment policies. Even in the 21st century, these principles remain relevant. Russia's resurgence, NATO's eastern expansion, and U.S.-China rivalry reflect Cold War dynamics. Modern hybrid warfare, including cyber attacks, economic sanctions, and disinformation, continues Cold War-era strategic competition. The Cold War may have formally ended, but its geopolitical foundations still shape today's world order. Understanding its history helps decode modern power struggles and anticipate future global conflicts.